Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MTGO Traders. My name is Taryn, and this is Mono Blue Amulet Mill. For those of you thinking that Mill is not that great in Standard, I would say hold on to that, because this deck is like 17 tickets and actually not that bad. This is Mono Blue Amulet Mill. This is a build that's basically taking out all the cards that were like rotating, so like Startled Awake, things like that, and putting in new cards from Ixalan like Primal Amulet, Opt, Run Aground, things like that, into it to give it some legs, Perilous Voyage as well to give it some legs so it can kind of go the distance and last a little bit longer in a matchup, as well as mill your opponent to death, because that's what we want to do. We want to mill our opponent to death. So let's get right into it, but actually before I get into it, make sure to hit the like button on the video and subscribe to the channel, of course, and hit the little bell right beside the subscription button to know when we upload new videos and we go and stream, all that kind of fun stuff. I'm gonna get right into it, so let's go. At the 1 mana slot, we have Minister of Inquiries. This is, of course, our awesome 1 mana 1/2 guy that enters the battlefield with 2 energy counters, and we can actually pay 1 energy and mill our opponent for 3. So having these guys on the battlefield with a Fraying Sanity is amazingly fun and good. Minister is also going to be helping blocking some damage in the mid to late game as well. So if your opponent doesn't want to burn a removal spell on Minister of Inquiries, it's going to do a lot of damage to them in the early to mid game. So moving on from the Minister, though, we have 3 Opt. This is from Ixalan, so it's 1 blue mana, scry 1, draw a card. So this is actually really, really good for us in the early to mid game where we want to be stabilizing, getting our Fraying Sanity out as soon as possible, because Opt is a great way to do that. And it can really help us like either have a situation where we need to draw into some more mill cards or maybe some more control heavy cards in the first game or in game 2. So Opt is fantastic for that. But let's move on from Opt and we go to Unsummon. We have 2 in the deck. We have 1 in the sideboard. Unsummon is here, and there's not a 4 of because we have Perilous Voyage. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But Unsummon is here to help go against any kind of token strategy we're going up against, any kind of internalized strategy, that kind of stuff. But it can help like slow down an opponent long enough so we can actually mill them to death, and that is the point of the deck. So we're trying to mill them as quickly as we can. And Unsummon is also really good at going with our Primal Amulet to try and get those counters so we can actually flip that card. So that's really good too. So moving on from Unsummon, we have 4 Compelling Argument. This is by far the best just straight up mill card right now in Standard, besides Ipni Rivulet, which is the land. Again, Compelling Argument, 2 mana, target player puts top 5 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, and it does have cycling for 1 blue mana. So in the early game, if it's in your opening hand, you have 2 lands and you haven't drawn another land, by turn 4, you probably want to cycle a Compelling Argument away because you want to get your Fraying Sanity situation going up as quickly as possible. So Compelling Argument is great for that, helping to stabilize. Again, the deck is all about trying to stabilize your Fraying Sanity as quickly as possible, and also your Amulet, so you can get those out of the battlefield and be able to mill your opponent as soon as possible. But moving on from Compelling Argument, we have 4 Perilous Voyage. This is another card from Ixalan, 2 mana instant, return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. If its converted mana cost was 2 or less, scry 2. So Perilous Voyage is not quite like Winds of Rebuke in that you can actually bounce your own Minister of Inquiries to get that energy back with a replay. Perilous Voyage is going to be bouncing a creature on your opponent's side of the field or a non-land permanent on your opponent's side of the field. So anything like an artifact or Heart of Kiran, stuff like that, but it's actually going to bounce it and give you the ability to scry 2, which is incredibly important. Again, just like with Opt, being able to scry 2 with Perilous Voyage is very, very good at being able to, again, stabilize your board, try and get your lands to spell ratio perfect, so whenever you have your next draws coming up, or if you want to bottom both of them, you're not just drawing into lands, flooding out, or drawing into spells that you don't need at the moment. So Perilous Voyage is very good for that. Super fantastic instant in this deck. But moving on from Perilous Voyage, we have 4 Winds of Rebuke. This is another really great mill/bounce spell for us. It's 2 mana for an instant. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Each player puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So again, it's a mill card, but it's also a card that's going to bounce cards. So if it's a counter, Planeswalker, things like that, and of course Fraying Sanity, if it's out on the battlefield and we do Winds of Rebuke, that's actually 4 cards instead of 2, so mill 4 cards and also bounce something on their side of the field. It's just so good. And of course, Winds of Rebuke also works for us if we want to bounce Minister of Inquiries or something like that for protection or to get some more energy back on the battlefield. But moving on from Winds of Rebuke, we have Supreme Will, which is of course our counter card. 3 mana for an instant, choose 1 counter target spell unless its controller pays 3 colorless mana, or look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand and the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. So this is a great way to go against any kind of control matchup. any kind of matchup where they're trying to go above you with larger creatures. So just hold up a Supreme Will in your hand, counter those cards, or if you're going up against a fast lower to the ground strategy, Supreme Will might be used to be digging for mill cards instead. So it's just a really great all-around card, has a lot of choices for us, and that's what we want to be having in the deck. We want to have a lot of choices and abilities to dig through our deck as quickly as we possibly can so we can get our mill strategy kind of going as soon as possible. So Supreme Will is great for that. But moving on from Supreme Will, we have 2 Glimmer of Genius. This is going to help feeding into our card draw strategy. So pay 4 mana, scry 2, then draw 2 cards, you get 2 energy. So the 2 energy is going to go for a Minister of Inquiries if they're on the battlefield or if we're about to play them. It's also going to be able to scry 2, so we can actually look at the top of our library. If we want those, we can draw them. If not, we put them on the bottom, things like that. It's just fantastic. Again, it's one of the best drawing cards in Standard at the moment. I mean, I would never do without 2 in this deck. Pull from Tomorrow is also a close one here, but I think Glimmer of Genius just works a little bit better because it does give us the energy for the Minister of Inquiries, so great for that. But moving on from this, we have River's Rebuke. This is a 6-mana sorcery. Return all non-land permanents target player controls to their owner's hand. So this is a one-sided ability here, and it's a great way to get rid of tokens. It's a great way to get rid of Godfrey's Gift, all that kind of stuff to make sure we can actually last an extra turn or 2. So River's Rebuke is really great at that, but this is our top-end card here. So it's one of those like last-ditch efforts to make sure we can last long enough to mill them out for the win. So that's why River's Rebuke is in the deck. But that is it for spells. Moving on from River's Rebuke, we have 3 Primal Amulet. Again, this is a card from Ixalan. It's amazingly good. So for 4 mana, it's an artifact. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 colorless less to cast. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a charge counter on Primal Amulet. Then if there are 4 or more charge counters on it, you may remove those counters and transform it. And when Primal Amulet transforms, it turns into Primal Wellspring, which is a land. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. When mana is spent to cast an instant or sorcery spell, copy that spell and you may choose new targets for the copy. So the best thing about this is that you can actually mill and then mill again. So like Compelling Argument mills for 5, well now it mills for 10. And if Fraying Sanity is on the battlefield, that's milling for 20. In the mid to late game, if Primal Amulet does flip and it turns into Primal Wellspring, you're basically guaranteed the match unless they've tippled you to death. So Primal Wellspring is incredibly powerful in a mill strategy here, and it's just super fun like to use against your opponent because they're just not expecting it when it's put into a mill strategy like this one. So I love it. I think this is great. And of course, we couldn't leave out the last 4 cards in the deck. We have Fraying Sanity, 3 colorless for an Aura Curse. Enchant player, at the beginning of each end step, enchant player puts top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, where X is the number of cards put into that graveyard from anywhere this turn. So Fraying Sanity is super good at being able to mill your opponent to death. So this is the reason we're running the deck, period, basically. Fraying Sanity is our win condition, but it isn't the only way we can actually win. So we have a lot of mill cards in the deck, and if we have Primal Wellspring out on the field as well, that's actually going to be a secondary way to be able to cycle our cards or be able to duplicate our cards, just like how Fraying Sanity does for our instants and sorcery spells. So even though we're not usually getting the extra 3 cards from the Minister of Inquiries thanks to Fraying Sanity, being able to copy a Winds of Rebuke, a Compelling Argument, things like that with a Primal Wellspring, that's going to do just as well as a Fraying Sanity would. But having them in tandem is actually just destructive. Like, it's just going to kill your opponent like on the same turn. But that is it for all the cards on the main board. Let's go over the lands real quick. We have 4 Aether Hub. The Aether Hub are in here basically just to feed the Minister of Inquiries. That's the only reason they're in here. This is a mono blue deck, so as soon as the energy is out, these guys are just colorless lands. Then we have 4 Ipni Revelate. This is another type of win condition for us, or mill condition as you would say. But it mills your opponent for 4 if we have a Fraying Sanity on the battlefield. It mills them for 8. This is super fun for us and super good, and we can actually do it on their turn. So if they draw into a card, we can mill them for 4 on their upkeep or draw step. So that's really, really good for us too. And then for our other card, we have 1 Scavenger Grounds. This is going to be a great way to get rid of any kind of Godfrey's Gift interaction if we need to. Again, in the entirety of our deck, we don't have anything that's going to be interacting with the graveyard, so Scavenger Grounds is a great way to kind of like lock down their graveyard because we're not really worried about ours at all. And then the last cards in the deck, we have 15 islands, and that is going to be it. That is the full 60 of the deck, and that's awesome. But let's say we're going up against a heavy control strategy or a heavy aggressive strategy. Let's just kind of go over and see what the sideboard does for us right here. So we have 2 Spell Pierce. This is going to be helping getting rid of any kind of planeswalkers that are coming down, or maybe a Approach to the Second Sun. So one of the things for me that I like doing if I'm playing against an Approach to the Second Sun deck is I let them cast it. I will counter it. It does go to the graveyard, so that means it doesn't go to the 7th from the top for them, and then I just continue to mill. So you'd be surprised how many players actually will play Approach the Second Sun and not expect a person to counter it. But if you're playing a mill deck, you basically want to every single time you can. But this is also a great way to kind of win against the counter race if you're trying to get out on turn 4 your Fraying Sanity and they try to Supreme Will it, where you're just going to play Spell Pierce, and then that's countered so you can actually get your Fraying Sanity on the battlefield. So Spell Pierce is a great way at kind of combating against another control setup. But moving on from Spell Pierce, we have another Unsummoned, just 1 more for us. A great way again to get rid of some creatures. If we need need another one, we can have it from the sideboard into the main board. So that's why Unsummon Seer, and it's great for that. Moving on from that, we have 2 Essence Scatter. Again, if we're going up against a super aggressive strategy, like a round-up red strategy, something like that, Essence Scatter is really great at being able to kind of out-tempo your opponent a little bit, throwing some creatures that you don't want on the field into the graveyard. Again, Earthshaker, Kinra, things that can be internalized, you want to make sure you want to be aware of that in the early to mid-game there, because those can come back. So I would say use this whenever they try to play out their Glory Bringers, their Hazarets, things like that. So I think Essence Scatter is great for that. But moving on from Essence Scatter, we have 2 Jace's Defeat. This is, of course, kind of a terrible card against certain matchups, but against any kind of like Thopter strategy, any kind of Izzet strategy, and a lot of the energy decks, Jace's Defeat is actually going to be helping to counter against any kind of like Jace Planeswalker, any kind of Whirler Virtuoso, Rogue Refiner, things like that. If there's blue in the name, as well as like Locust God, things like that, Jace's Defeat is going to help deal with that as quickly as possible. What I would also recommend doing is have 5 mana, play Jace's Defeat against a Scarab God, have a Scavenger Grounds, tap 2 more mana, tap Scavenger Grounds, and then get that Scarab God out of their graveyard. Scarab God is a total pain in the butt, and it is one of the cards that is like the best card in Standard right now, but you can work around it if you mill them to death. So that's why that's in there. Moving on from that, we have 2 Negate. So this is again going to be going up against any kind of removal heavy strategy or any kind of heavy counter strategy. So Negate is perfect for going up against those kind of matchups. I would always play it in the sideboard, from the sideboard rather, into the main board if I know I'm going up against a person that's playing a lot of non-creature spells. So pretty simple there. Moving on from this, we have 1 Sorcerer Spyglass. This is a great card at helping shut down any kind of strategy we don't like, as far as any kind of Planeswalkers, things like that. And of course, the effect of Spyglass is you can actually look at your opponent's hand, and then we can name a card. So if we're playing up on game 1 against an opponent, we actually might just want to use this as a peek, and then go, okay, we'll just assume that they have like Vraska Relic Seeker, so we're going to name that. Or let's say Scrap Heap Scrounger, things like that for Sorcerer Spyglass. It's a really great way to kind of shutting down your opponent if you're actually milling cards into the graveyard, and they can actually get them out like Scrap Heap Scrounger, things like that. Sorcerer Spyglass is just an overall great card, but just only 1 up in the sideboard. We also have 2 Disallow. This is going to be fighting against the control matchup, where like you play a control card, then they play a control card, or you play a Frank Sanity first, and you try to get the those cards out the way you want them to be, or you're just going to put Disallow in here when you want to get rid of any kind of like big bomb play that they're coming down with. Of course, Carnage Tyrant can't count for this, so that's going to be one of the cards that's going to be a giant thorn in our side most of the time. But that is totally fine. I think we'll be okay with it. Then the last cards of the deck, we have 1 Run Aground. This is a card that's going to put an artifact or a creature on top of their deck, and then we can just mill it away that same turn. So if we have a Minister of Inquiries on our battlefield at the same time, we can bounce whatever's on the battlefield on the top of their deck, and then tap our Minister of Inquiries, and then that goes to the graveyard. So this is a great way of getting rid of a Godfrey's Gift deck, any kind of like large strategy or a large creature like a Locust God or a Scarab God, stuff like that. I think Run Aground is incredibly powerful for that. Even though it is 4 mana, there's only 1 in the sideboard, but I think it might actually require like 2 in the deck. I don't know. And the last 2 cards in the deck, you know what's going to be in here. We have 2 Fleet Swallower. Now, one thing I want to say is a Fleet Swallower is kind of like a Terabad card, but it's a mill deck, and I want to put it in the sideboard because if you're going up against a strategy that doesn't have a lot of removal, that doesn't have a very fast creature strategy, then the Fleet Swallower is amazing for that. If it gets off even 1 time, it halves your opponent's deck in half. So that is to be respected. Even though it's 7 mana, I think it's incredibly important if you want to have it against a more creature-heavy strategy, or strategy that is not going to be relying so much on countering, removing, things like that. So I think Fleet Swallower actually benefits a lot against Godfrey's Gift deck, things like that, where they don't actually like necessarily interact with your board state. But I think at the same time, Fleet Swallower is 7 mana, so probably no more than just 1 from the sideboard into the main board. So you might want to use another copy of Run Aground instead of a second Fleet Swallower. So that's just my opinion there. But that is the full 75 of the deck. On MTGO Traders, it's actually coming to like a decent 17 tickets, which is ridiculously low for a deck like this. It's just a ton of fun, and it can just ruin a deck if they draw it incorrectly or poorly. And you can actually just like straight up mill somebody to death by turn 5 or 6 with your strategy. So it's just awesome. Again, Primal Amulet makes everything cheaper for you. So like a Compelling Argument is 1 mana, a Winds of Rebuke is 1 mana, and that just puts the counters on top of that card. So when it flips, I mean, you can just do that all day long with the countering and then the duplicating of your spells. But here you go, let's just move to the layout here. Here's the full deck laid out for you, all nice and pretty. One thing I will say that a lot of people were asking me about, because I did do this on stream first, is that Opt is in the deck instead of like Search for Azcanta. One of the things for Opt is that I just like the tempo base more on Opt instead of Search for Azcanta. However, if you do prefer Search for Azcanta, I say definitely go for it. This is not like a rock solid strategy. This is just me kind of like putting a deck together and saying, I think this is a lot of fun. And it's won quite a few matches for me. So if you think Search for Azcanta is a better spot than Opt, definitely go for it because that card is super good as well. But that's going to do it for the video, guys. Hope you liked it. Like the video if you liked it, of course. Leave a comment below on what you think of the deck and if you have any kind of changes for the deck. I know the deck is definitely like kind of like very malleable and flexible, but let me know in the comments below, and of course subscribe to the channel if you want to. I'll see you guys in the next video.